Yeah, so Emily and the kids set that up well. We are talking about character. We are on a sermon series, a post-Easter sermon series, talking about character, specifically Christian character, and like what that means when we talk about being a person of character, being a Christian of character. And we have looked at a handful of Bible characters to see if we can learn from them, attributes, personality traits that perhaps we should also see reflected in ourselves if we are to be Easter people, if we actually believe this Easter thing that we celebrated a few weeks ago, if we are to be Pentecost people, which we will celebrate in a few weeks, that the resurrected Christ actually lives in our lives. What should people see in us? What sort of attributes, what sort of character traits should be evident in us if we are to be Easter people, we are to be Pentecost people? So we've taken some time and we first looked at Timothy and Ruth, who we called kind of young, multicultural, mixed-race millennials of their day, and the flexibility. They were bilingual, they were adventurous, they were hardworking, and how some of the adults in their lives tried to kind of force them into certain molds that probably wasn't necessary, and so we can learn from the characteristics of our young, multicultural, bilingual millennials today, even, and what they can teach us. We also took a look at Samson, hero of the Old Testament, who actually, when you look a little bit closer, was probably somebody who could have used a little more therapy, and maybe had a partner that would ask him some hard questions, because he really, the sharp spots of his character were never really worn down. He had kind of unmitigated lust. He went after whatever he wanted, and he typically used violence to get it, and he laid waste to his enemies and humiliated people in the process. So probably don't want to follow those characteristics of Samson. And then last week, Kristen talked about one of the more famous women of the Bible, who was the crowning achievement, like the best version of creation that God created, which was Eve, right? And yet that's not typically the way you hear conversations or how Eve is depicted, right? It kind of depends on who's reading the text and how they understand the text. Same thing with Samson. The thing about character is it really depends who's telling you what character is and what lens they are viewing it through. And it also kind of depends on the situation and the context in which you're in, right? Some of us can say what the characteristics of a woman of fine character 150 years ago, we probably would not say that those are the same characteristics we would want a woman to have today, right? Or some of them would be, some of them wouldn't. Character is a little bit of a moving target. And so this morning, what I want us to do is talk about that aspect of character and biblical character. We're going to do it by looking at Barnabas. This is a two-part series, because I'm going to talk more about Barnabas next week. But we're going to begin looking at him and what happened in the first century, because we're talking about Christian character. And the interesting thing about we as Christians is that we weren't called Christians for quite a while. That name had a beginning, and I want to look at that story in the Bible and what made us Christians, where Christianity kind of came into being. And it's found in Acts chapter 11. If you want to turn to Acts chapter 11, we're going to get there. I'm going to give you a little bit of a prelude, a precursor. But Acts, as most of you probably know, is the Acts of the Apostles. It is the stories of what happened after Jesus died and was resurrected. And then he filled his disciples and said, "Go, therefore, into all the world and proclaim the good news and baptize people." And he kind of tells them to go to all these places. But the followers of Christ, and James and Peter were the two leaders of the church in Jerusalem, they kind of, as far as we could tell, just kind of stayed there. They were trying to figure out what to do. They saw some growth early on, but they also saw some pretty serious persecution. Some of them were killed. And so they were kind of huddled in Jerusalem trying to figure out exactly what they should do as these Jewish Christ followers. And as they're gathered there, something happens to Peter. He has an interaction with a guy named Cornelius, who's a Roman. You're not supposed to interact with Romans, these uncircumcised heathen who are also kind of the military oppressors. But Peter has this chance encounter with Cornelius. God gives Peter a dream, and Peter's like, wait a minute, guys. He gets together with the friends in Jerusalem. He says, maybe we might need to approach this whole thing a little bit differently. God might have something else in mind for us. We're huddled here in Jerusalem. So they start talking about this, and while they're talking, all of a sudden word comes from the boondocks, way far north, way away from Jerusalem, where they were in this place called Antioch, where Romans and Greeks, again, uncircumcised heathen, were all of a sudden saying that they were members of the way. They were followers of Jesus Christ. And this group back in Jerusalem was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is headquarters. I'm Peter, he's James. Not sure what you're talking about in Antioch. So what they do is they send one of their best disciples, a guy named Barnabas, and they say, we want you to head up there and see what's going on. So that's the setting for Acts chapter 11. If you've got your Bible, I encourage you to read along with me. I will put some of this up on the screen here. But starting in verse 19, it says this, now, those who were, it kind of repeats what I already said, but those who were scattered as a result of the trouble that occurred because of Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch. So some people kind of ran away after Stephen was killed. Stephen was one of the early disciples. And it says this, it says, they, these Jewish followers of Jesus, proclaimed the word only to who? Anybody reading this? Jews. They proclaimed the word only to Jews. That was the plan. You go forth and you proclaim the word to Jews. We're going to bring Jews into this new following, this Rabbi Jesus. And among them were some people from Cyprus and Cyrene. They entered into Antioch, again, which is way north, right up against the border of Turkey. And they began to proclaim the good news about the Lord Jesus to Jews who spoke Greek. So they kind of went a little bit, so they're talking to Jews who spoke Greek, but they're still talking to Jews. And the Lord's power was with them, and a large number came to believe and turn to the Lord. Now, when the church heard of this, let's see, I've got my screen. Yeah. When the church in Jerusalem heard about this, they sent Barnabas to Antioch. Now, here's the deal. What they don't kind of clarify here is that the Jews who spoke Greek in Antioch, it's like some Gentiles, some Romans and some Greeks overheard them, and the church wasn't necessarily growing among the Jewish Greek speakers. It was growing among the Gentiles who spoke Greek. That's where it started to take off in Antioch. And so Barnabas heads up there, and it says, they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived and saw evidence of God's grace, he was overjoyed and encouraged everyone to remain fully committed to the Lord. Barnabas responded in this way because he was a good man, whom the Holy Spirit had endowed with exceptional faith. A considerable number of people were added to the Lord. And then Barnabas, check this out, Barnabas went to Tarsus in search of Saul. Who's Saul? Remember Saul? Saul, yeah, he's called Paul later on. He's called Saul. That was his name when he was the persecutor of these followers of Jesus. He literally was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a very strict religious Jewish man, and he was one of the people that led the charge to find these followers of Jesus, these Jewish followers of Jesus, and track them down, interrogate them, put them in prison, and sometimes even kill them. And so Barnabas goes up to Antioch, sees this thing that's happening, this kind of crazy thing where all of these people who aren't necessarily supposed to be, it's not in the plans, they're not supposed to be following Jesus, but they're saying that they are. And Barnabas says, I know who I need to go get. I'm going to go get Saul. And so he goes even further north into the west, into Turkey, and gets Saul of Tarsus, this guy who not that long ago was persecuting and jailing these Jewish followers of Jesus. And so he goes and finds Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch, and they were there for a whole year, meeting with the church and teaching large numbers of people. It was in Antioch where the disciples were first labeled Christians. I just think it's fascinating that the place where the name, we wouldn't be called Christians now if it wasn't for Antioch. The place where we got our name, the reason we are Christians, is because somebody didn't go according to the script. It was because people deviated from the plan. The plan was being hatched in Jerusalem, and the plan was to just speak to Jews, but somehow Gentiles, Romans, Greeks overheard this, and the Spirit of the living Christ began to work in their midst, and the disciples send Barnabas up north, And I don't know about you, but typically when headquarters sends somebody out to a region where some strange things are happening. Now let me just try to put this in context with you. Say that all of us are good Christians in Kansas City, but we kind of have this new revelation. It's kind of weird. It's really revolutionary, but it's a different way for us to interpret our faith. And we're talking about what should we do, and this is really great. And then all of a sudden we get word from someone who's been in Chicago that a bunch of Hindus in Chicago are saying the exact same thing as us and saying that they believe the exact same thing. Be like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Antioch? That wasn't our plan. Let's send Barnabas up there. And as Barnabas is sent up, and Barnabas is a man, I love it. He's a good man of exceptional faith. If I was Barnabas, being a little bit of a type A personality, I probably would have walked into Antioch and said, hey, could everyone just get together here? So who started this thing? And I want to hear, what are you saying? And who are you? And how are you uncircumcised people doing this? And what, let's try to rein this thing in. There's a little bit of chaos happening here, things that are not probably supposed to be happening. But what does Barnabas see when he goes to Antioch? He sees evidence of what? Grace. He sees the grace of God at work. I just love this. I love that Christianity began when the plan went off the rails and people took charge and started doing things that the folks back in Jerusalem didn't even know was happening. And they send one of their people forward, a man who is filled with faith, a good man. And rather than going in and cracking the whip and saying, hey, what are you doing? He steps back and is able to discern the grace of God is at work in this place. Something bigger than myself, something bigger than us at headquarters. And he not only encourages them, he has this epiphany, I'm going to go and get Saul of Tarsus. What kind of an idea is that? This guy who just a little bit ago was persecuting these Christians or these followers of Jesus, I'm going to get him and bring him back here. And together the two of us are going to teach and we're going to stay here for a year and the church is going to explode. What a crazy, ridiculous plan. And it worked wonderfully because the Spirit of the living Christ was in the midst of all of it. According to them, changing plans, doing things differently, but Barnabas, thank God, was able to see the grace of God at work, was able to pull in a weird leader like Paul, and the two of them were able to work together. And then as we go on in the book of Acts, the interesting thing is that it's Barnabas and Saul, and Barnabas is kind of mentoring Saul. Within a couple of chapters, Luke, the author of Acts, begins to refer to them as Paul and Barnabas. Paul becomes the leader. Barnabas doesn't leave. Somehow he has the integrity and the character to say, okay, this guy's a little bit more articulate than me. God's using him in a special way. And so now it's not Barnabas and Saul, it's Paul and Barnabas. And they stick around. They continue. They go on missionary journeys together. When all of a sudden the weird people take the lead or strange things happen or the plans go off the rails, do we want to get in and control it and change it, or do we see evidence of the grace of God at work? That's what happened in Antioch. That's where Christians were first called Christians, was in the midst of this wonderful chaos and this new thing that Jesus was doing. So character, I would say, as Christians, is not something that is necessarily acquired through practicing good religion or memorizing a list of morals or even following the original plan. Character is not following a list. Character is following a person, the living Christ, who tends to sometimes deviate from the original plan, at least our understanding of the original plan. To be a person of character, to be a Christian character, is to follow the character of Christ. And sometimes the Spirit of the resurrected Christ does new things in new ways. And our job is not to hold on to the original plan, but to hold tight to the living Christ. And together, continue to try to discern what the grace of God, the new thing that God is doing in the world. That's what it means to be a Christian of character. The other thing that's interesting about character and talking about what it means to be a person of character is that character, as I said, isn't something that necessarily stays exactly the same from one situation, one time, one scenario to the next. It's also something that we can never fully attain. You can't say, oh, good, finally now I'm a person of character. I've got it. I've got these characteristics. I've attained them. I've worked hard at it. Character is something that we grow into, something that we work at throughout our lives. It is, again, not a list of attributes, but it is the work of the living Christ in our life. And once we think we've got there, we've got it locked down, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we become the hypocrites that we don't want to be. Being a person of character means a person that lives in the dynamism, in a dynamic faith, in a dynamic relationship that allows for us to recognize and to see when the Spirit's winds shift, to stay in relationship, to stay in contact, and to do the best we can to learn along the way. Character growth is always dynamic. It's always a process. Another book that I've been reading for this series is called Commentary on Character. It's by Stanley Hauerwas, and Stanley Hauerwas is a brilliant theologian, and he speaks about character and how we develop character in the Christian church and what that means. And he says this, he says that building character requires constant vigilance if growth is to occur. And then he says this, he says, as soon as we feel like we've made it, as soon as we feel like we've made it, we discover that we have lost the skills to sustain it. The greater the integrity of our character, the more we are liable to self-deception and fault. Character requires a narrative that offers the skills to recognize the ambiguity of our achievements and the necessity of continued growth. I love that. Character requires a narrative that offers the skills to recognize the ambiguity of our achievements and the necessity of continued growth. We have got to couple ourselves. We've got to latch on to a narrative and to a story that reminds us again and again, it's not about my achievements. It's not about me telling you how righteous I've become or how professional I become or how proficient I become in one thing or another. We got to latch ourselves onto a narrative that says, no, this is constantly a lifetime of learning, of knowing and being known, of failing and standing up again, of staying in the conversation, of staying at the table. And that's what's wonderful about our Christian faith. That's what's wonderful, as I said this morning, about you all showing up here this morning. Sometimes we don't want to go to church. Sometimes we don't want to go to that small group we signed up for. Sometimes we don't want to have those people come and visit us when we're sick, or we don't want to do X and Y. But what we do is we say, no, we're just going to keep showing up because that's what we do. And we don't just show up so that we can further calcify and solidify our way of being and doing. We keep showing up so that we can keep being in contact and in conversation with people who are different than us. And we can share our lives and we can learn about their lives. And as we do that, we recognize where maybe we've been wrong and we ask for forgiveness and we recognize what we can learn from others. It's a dynamic process. Being a Christian of character is someone who's committed to community, not someone who's committed to a list of rules, but someone who is committed to the character, which is Jesus Christ, the living Christ. So this is the narrative we attach ourselves to, this lifestyle, this lifetime, this mentality of growth and change and engagement. It's why we are doing another strategic plan at Second Presbyterian Church. Someone said, didn't we do one of those 7-8 years ago? Yeah, we did. Yep. This is what we do. We've got to ask ourselves again and again, God, are we still following you? Is everything... Because things have shifted, and we just want to make sure we haven't just got ourselves into a system and we just keep turning the crank and making things happen. We want to make sure that the living Christ isn't speaking something to us that perhaps we're not seeing or hearing. That perhaps the living Christ is doing something in Antioch that might not fit the rules of Jerusalem, but calls us to be aware and to recognize not chaos, but the grace of God at work. Another book that I've been reading and a character I've been reading about is a gentleman whose name is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Has anybody read or heard of Erasmus? Erasmus, he was actually, without Erasmus, we might not have had Martin Luther. Erasmus was born and lived in the Low Countries, they called it, Netherlands. There he is. He was a priest, Augustinian priest. He went to an order and trained to be a priest and was a brilliant man. But he saw some problems in the Catholic Church and in Rome, and he kind of wrote critically about them. But he also was committed to Jesus Christ, which sounds kind of weird, but for a priest at that time, he really was committed to the Scriptures, and he called it the philosophy of Christ. He wanted to know Christ, and he wanted to understand Christ more. Again, sounds like something a priest should typically do, but what had happened in the Catholic Church at that time, which was the church, was that basically religion was not necessarily about, in the end it was about following Jesus, but it was about following the rules. And there was Mass, and you learned how to say the Mass, and you learned how to accept people's and listen to people's confession, and all the things that you were trained in as a priest had a lot to do with kind of following the rules of Christendom. And I don't think that was me. So where was I? So Erasmus loved to read the Bible, and when I say the Bible at this time, there was only one Bible, and it was called the Vulgate. And it was, you guys know what language the Bible would have been written in? Latin. It was written in Latin. It had been translated into Latin in the year 380 when the Pope at that time commissioned one of the most brilliant scholars of the time. His name was Jerome. He was trilingual. He spoke and read Greek and Hebrew and Latin. Jerome took the texts that he could find of Greek and Hebrew, and he translated them into the Vulgate, it was called, into the Bible. So the Latin Vulgate, written by Jerome in 380, was the Bible. It was the Bible the church used. And so when you talked about the Bible, you talked about the Vulgate. So for 1,000 years, that had been the Bible that everyone read out of. And Erasmus of Rotterdam, he's reading it, and he says, actually, I think, and he was kind of a lingual nerd, he said, I would love to read this in Greek and Hebrew, but nobody teaches Greek and Hebrew. They didn't teach Greek and Hebrew in the seminaries at that time. You taught Latin, that was it. So he had to go teach himself, find people who could teach him biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek, and then from that, he then began searching for old lost manuscripts in the original Greek and Hebrew, and he said, I want to do what Jerome did. I want to rewrite the New Testament based on those original documents in Latin. And it was amazing. And you would think that most people those days, the scholars, the priests, others, would be thrilled that he was doing this. What do you think the response was? They wanted to kill him. Why? Because he was messing with the Bible. You don't mess with the Bible. And Erasmus would say, no, I understand. You're talking about the Vulgate, which is a translation of the Greek and the Hebrew. And the more he worked on that translation, Erasmus thought Jerome was brilliant. And Jerome made a lot of mistakes. I can see he just miscopied some things, or I don't think the word that he chose in Latin was the right word to choose here or there. And so as Erasmus rewrote the New Testament, he thought, in a better edition. He had more knowledge, he had more manuscripts to work from. What do you think the church thought about that? No. Don't mess with the Bible. And Erasmus is like, no, this is the Vulgate written by Jerome. I'm just trying to improve. I want to do what he did. Nope, don't touch it. Don't mess with it. But you couldn't stop Erasmus. And by the end of his life, he had rewritten it 3 different times. He continued to improve upon the mistakes that he made. And because of Erasmus, I have the theological education I had today. I had to learn Greek and Hebrew, and it revolutionized graduate studies in theology from then on. One of the things that Erasmus did is he would write little annotations on the side as he was translating. And he got in trouble for a number of places where he messed with things that you don't mess with because it's the Bible. And the one verse that he got in the most trouble with is he translated this verse. For John 1, in the beginning was the Word, right? Everybody know this one, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became what? Flesh, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's the most beautiful, powerful, high Christology in all of Scripture. This is John, the beginning of John, the prologue of John. Jesus Christ is the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so Erasmus looks at this and he says, okay, the Greek word here is logos, or logos. It's a super dynamic word. Those of you who have studied other languages, sometimes in one language, like in German, you can have this fantastic word. It just doesn't translate into English. It's too dynamic. It takes like 7 or 8 words to translate the same meaning. You know what I'm talking about? Logos is one of those words. It doesn't translate well into one word. It's a fantastic Greek word, but what it means is creative, dynamic, interactive word or wording or speaking or whatever. It's a very dynamic word. And the way that it had been translated in Latin was, in Latin, you could choose 2 words that meant word, and the one was verbum, and that was the word that Jerome had chosen, and that means the word. So in the beginning was the word. So in English, we translated it again into in the beginning was the word. If you read a Spanish Bible today, it says in the beginning was the verb. That's how they translate it in Spanish. In the beginning was the verb. Isn't that great? I love that. Both come from the same word, which come from logos. So this is translation upon translation. In the beginning was the verb. Well, what Erasmus said is, I don't think that is even dynamic enough. I think God was talking about a creative process. And so the word that Erasmus used was sermo. Sermo, the root of what would today be a sermon, but you don't think about it that way. It was more of a lecture. But in those days, in a university, the beginning of the universities, they used the Socratic method. In the Socratic method, you would have a professor read the text and put forth something, and then the students would ask a question, and there would be an answer, and together you would move towards the truth, right? And so this is what Erasmus did. He rewrote it, and he said, in the beginning was the conversation. Same word. In the beginning was the conversation. In the beginning was the creative God who spoke into the world, and the world spoke back, and God spoke into the world. That this idea of growing as a Christian is not something you learn once and it becomes static and you can put it in a book and it's done. No, folks, this is a conversation. You have to keep showing up. You have to keep learning. You have to keep bringing your understanding to bear, and then you listen to others. You keep bringing your prayers to God, and God responds to you. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us. If we're going to be Christians, we're going to be people who are committed to the conversation. Even if that conversation feels chaotic, or even if people are included in that conversation who used to be persecutors, or might be enemies, or foreigners. In the beginning was the conversation. I love it. You can disagree with Erasmus, but I think that concept, that understanding of Christian character, not as a static thing that we attain to, but a dynamic process that we commit our lives and our lifestyles to, is one that is quite compelling. We all know people, and I know that I have been this person, who is good at following rules, understanding what is said, interpreting that, memorizing that, and then following that forward. The church has been good at this. One of the reasons the church leaders didn't want Erasmus messing with the Bible is because they had built up an entire work of tradition and roles, and who should do what and who shouldn't, and how to behave and how to believe based on that static interpretation. And righteous people like me and like they are committed to living and believing and doing the right thing, but as Christians of character, we're called to something higher. We're called to a dynamic faith. We're called to be filled with and to follow not a list, but a person. Jesus the Christ, who lives and reigns among us today. So what do we do if we want to be people of Christian character? What does that mean for us? And I think simply put, I would say, just do your best to stay in the conversation. Stay in the conversation. And not the echo chamber conversation of people who just think the same as you and read the same as you. No, stay engaged in those hard conversations. Stay engaged at the conversation. Stay at the table and continue to break bread with people that you might not be that familiar with. Continue to share and to care for people that you might not even like. Continue to seek to try to love and to understand and to grow even when you don't want to, when it'd be a lot easier just to stay home and watch Netflix and listen to the news channel that you always listen to. Stay in the conversation. Stay dynamic. Allow yourself to continue to be changed. Allow the chaos of life to perhaps be seen as something where the grace of God is at work and where you can learn how to do a new thing in a new way. As Christians, we stay in the conversation. We try to remember that my answers, my perspective, my tradition, my expectations are not the goal. Jesus Christ is. And when things don't go our way, when failure or change or the unexpected crashes into our paths, rather than see inconvenience, rather than dismiss it as chaos, we might ask Christ to help us to continue to see evidence of the grace of God. And the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us and in us. We keep coming, friends, back to this table. We keep loving each other. We keep trying and we keep serving. We keep making mistakes and admitting them and asking for forgiveness, but we stay at the table. We stay in the conversation. And the character of Christ is formed in us so that we can more fully known and be more fully known by the living God. As the choir sings our reflective hymn, it's a beautiful hymn, and I would encourage you to open up to it. The refrain is beautiful, and maybe after they sing it a couple times, you'd be willing to join into the refrain. But also, as a time of reflection, maybe just run through this list of questions in your head and see if there's some work that we can do in our own lives to help ourselves or someone else to stay at the table, to stay in the conversation, and be Christians of character.